most of you might have picked up that I kind of like science fiction just a tiny little bit. It's probably fair to say that the only thing that I like more than science fiction is gender studies. So I actually just wanted to take today's video to kind of share with you some of my top 10 favorite science fiction shows that are currently on the air or have aired recently within the past few years. I think a few of these are kind of under the radar gems that not a lot of you may have heard about, but even if they are something that you may have heard about, maybe you haven't actually given them a chance, and I think that you 100% should, and this will be my kind of way to evangelize these shows to all of you. That also being said, I did give myself a couple rules when making this top 10 list. The first of which is that these were all going to be modern science fiction shows, and I'm kind of defining modern in a very limited sense, saying that all of these shows that are on this list had to release the predominant amount of their episodes within the past 10 years. So that means things like even Battlestar Galactica or Fringe couldn't make this list, even though if I was making like an overall, best science fiction TV shows of all time, they would at least be in the consideration. The second rule that I gave myself is that I was only allowed to have one TV show per franchise. So, and I'm not revealing if I did or not, but if I did put any TV shows from like Star Wars or Star Trek on here, I was only allowed to pick one show from that franchise as a whole in order to make sure that I gave room for like other things that people may not have heard of. The third rule is that I chose to have no anthology shows, so that means like things like Black Mirror or Love, Death, and Robots is also not going to be on the list. And then the final rule that I gave myself is that there was going to be no superhero shows on this list. While I do love superhero shows, and I do think there are some fan-freaking-tastic ones on here that I think could have made this list, like Watchmen, for example, I wanted to kind of broaden it more to like science fiction as a whole rather than the most popular form of media today. So with those rules out of the way, let's get on with the list, starting with number 10, Counterpart. Honest to God, I'm going to say this right here. While this is at the bottom of the list, this show, quite honestly, could have been right at the top. And the only reason that it is not is that, unfortunately, this show was canceled at the end of season 2. And while it doesn't end on like a big cliffhanger, there is a sense of finality to that season 2 cliffhanger. It's very clear also that there were more stories that the showrunners wanted to tell with this show. So if that's something that could like knock you off of it, I certainly understand. But this show gets a huge recommendation from me, and I do think that it's still worth watching, even though there are still more stories that they wanted to tell, starting with like a possible season 3. But considering that it was canceled before its prime, I'm betting a lot of you have not heard of this show, so let me just say that this show stars the amazing J.K. Simmons in a freaking phenomenal role, because what this show centers around is a world where we have two distinct universes that were created at the exact same time, and they are exact copies of each other. And I won't exactly spoil how or when they differentiated, but what we essentially learn is that these two universes went on their own separate courses and have their own distinct differences, and as a result, both universes created their own essential agency and spy network to spy on the other ones, and eventually created a very similar situation that is analogous to like the Cold War and the Berlin Wall. So if you love like Cold War spy espionage type thrillers, this is definitely the show for you. But what it also wonderfully mixes with is ideas of nature versus nurture, because since these universes were created at the exact same time, most of our characters have the same childhood and then at one point start to diverge. So when we meet characters like J.K. Simmons, we see two distinct versions of himself, one who is a more hardened, darkened spy, and the other who's just like kind of a normal dude. And you start to wonder what caused these two very different personalities to occur in this man who shared pretty much most of the same life. It's a phenomenal spy thriller that I cannot recommend enough. Like, if you love J.K. Simmons, if you love Cold War espionage, if you love like weird sci-fi concepts, Counterpart is freaking amazing.
Anyway, based on the math, we know these two women share a past. 9, 10 years before the timeline diverged. Same childhood, traumas, behavioral, whatever. Right now, Baldwin is hurt. She's in a city that's not her own. She has to act impulsively. When she acts impulsively, she acts like herself. So the more we get on Nadia, the more we learn about where Baldwin might go. Okay, what exactly is it that you do for a living? I do a lot of things, including retrieval. Come over here, quick trips, find defectors, and bring them home.
But that brings us to number 9, Raised by Wolves. Raised by Wolves, which is executive produced by Ridley Scott, is basically what you would get if you took the movie Prometheus or Alien Covenant and took all the ideas of religion and androids and all the things that Ridley Scott clearly wanted to explore with those movies and removed the necessity to have to make it like an Alien prequel. Like, quite literally, this show is Prometheus, but without having to be tied to all that alien mythology, and it is so freaking good. The basic concept follows two androids who crash land on a planet after the Earth is destroyed after a religious versus atheist kind of war, and they have to raise children. But the planet may have much more to it than it would initially appear, and it starts to get caught up in things of asking questions of God and life and rebirth and things like Adam and Eve, and there's a lot of really interesting religious imagery throughout this show. Most science fiction shows have these big, complex world systems going on, but this show, especially at the start, it gets more complicated as it goes along, starts off really just very, very sparse and really hones in on the ideas that it really wants to explore, and then starts slowly adding more mythology and layers and mysteries to it. And it does so really brilliantly. And it's also got this like creeping edge of horror throughout it as well that does kind of come in from the Alien franchise, but it feels new and fresh in a way that that movie couldn't, because we already knew what these xenomorphs were. So if you're looking for some very, very, very heady science fiction, Raised by Wolves is phenomenal. Number 8, Infinity Train. This is one that I was actually kind of shocked that I put on the list, but when I was sort of casting my net out and looking at like all the different science fiction shows that I had watched that come out over the past 10 years, I was shocked to constantly seeing Infinity Train coming up. For those of you who may not have heard of this show, it is ostensibly a kid's show, but honestly feels much deeper. Each season consists of only 10 episodes that are only 10 minutes long and basically follow a new person each season that arrives on this mysterious train. And I don't want to spoil too much if you haven't watched the first season, because pretty much the entirety of the first season of the show is figuring out what this train is, what the mystery of it is, and what's going on with it. But we do initially start in that first season with this young girl who comes onto this train and gets a number on her hand, and the number starts strangely going down after certain experiences that she has. And this train, by the way, is also infinite. Like, you can see this goes on for miles and miles and miles and miles with no end in sight. So our main character is essentially trying to get to the front of the train and figuring out what the hell is going on with the train and with her number. And it's just a fantastically fun series that talks a lot about empathy and how we come to understand ourselves and care for others as well. But it also is a lot darker than you would initially expect a kid's show to be. It like kind of has this very kind of dark vibe to it that kids can definitely watch, but especially in seasons like 3 and 4, can get very dark and explore very complicated themes. So if you have not seen Infinity Train and you love sort of like weird mystery stuff and you want something that can be binged pretty quickly, like there's only 4 seasons and they all tell like their one season in about 2 hours or so, I would highly recommend this show to you.
300 miles is not a quick hop. Well, that's lucky.
Number 7, Rick and Morty. Okay, so this is one of those shows that, of course, pretty much all of you have probably heard of in some way, shape, or form. I mean, it's become its own institution at this point, and it also might be, strangely, a bit of a controversial pick. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion surrounding how characters like Rick have been aggrandized as these sort of, like, very toxic figures who aren't really critiqued enough by the show itself. But I do feel like more recent seasons have started to critique and understand that a lot more. But moving even beyond that controversial stuff, I really think that for better or for worse, Rick and Morty has been one of the most influential shows on science fiction television writing in the past, like, decade or so. This show just packs so many random, weird, out there, crazy, bonkers concepts and still, like, manages to ground them in absolutely hilarious comedy and also, like, really interesting character arcs and growth. Like, all of these characters, from Rick to Morty to everybody, really has, like, surprising depth to them for an animated cartoon cartoon, like, comedy show. Like, I'm honestly shocked by how much, like, these characters do kind of grow and change over the course of the series. But what really makes Rick and Morty special is just the sheer level of inventiveness. Like, there are so many episodes that I'm like, this is so cool. I never would have thought this possible to be able to do on, like, a television show. So yes, is it a little bit gruff and very edgy in a lot of aspects that may not be for everyone? Most certainly, but I really don't think you can talk about science fiction of the last 10 years without at least mentioning how important and influential Rick and Morty has been.
Who doesn't wish they could talk to animals, Rick?
Most humans? There, I'm done. Just stay out of trouble.
Gotta keep moving, can't stop, up, down, up, down, up, stop, down.
The Queen needs food. The babies need food. The Queen makes babies.
The situation in Argentina has proven less convenient than predicted.
Well, we'll have to re-destabilize their economy, refocus labor class outrage from upper to middle, foster a coup, and install a compliant regime.
Same as Guatemala?
Yes, but you can double time it.
Number 6, Star Trek Lower Decks. Alright, well, we were just talking about Rick and Morty, and this is a show that was created by one of the former showrunners of Rick and Morty, Mike McMahon himself, and of course you knew that I had to include a Star Trek show somewhere on this list. I would honestly be ashamed of myself if I didn't include a Star Trek show. I would be ashamed of Star Trek if I didn't include a Star Trek show on this list somewhere. And I also know that Star Trek Lower Decks, to some of you out there, might also be a controversial pick, especially when we have something like Strange New Worlds of Prodigy, or even more controversially, though I still love it, Discovery out there. But I also will admit that for me, Lower Decks is certainly a preference. I do not think Lower Decks will be for everybody, but I also think that Lower Decks is something incredibly, incredibly special. On the surface, many people may think that this show is just like a nostalgia, Easter egg, fan wanking fest, and it does have that. Like, it certainly speaks to me as someone who's a big Star Trek fan and loves all the references, loves all the like call outs to different elements of different parts of Star Trek lore, specifically Next Generation. But I also think that this show just does so many smart and wonderful things, even within all of that like nostalgia stuff. It manages to be a show that deconstructs a lot of the Next Generation era Star Trek shows, and yet also manages to uphold all of those same ideals at the same time. These characters in this show feel also so fully fleshed out. Tendi is honestly one of my favorite Star Trek characters of all time. She is just so optimistic and full of joy and warmth, and I just love seeing her as well as Boimler and Mariner and Rutherford's growth throughout the series. And I really just, and even the background characters, the bridge characters, also get like truly wonderful moments throughout the entire show. And then not only that, it's funny, not just on a look at all these references level, though that can be fun in and of itself, but also manages to tell, like Rick and Morty before it, really clever, unique science fiction stories that really evolve the Star Trek mythos. Like, I think in particular, without spoiling too much, episode 9 of both season 1 and season 2, Crisis Point and Weege Dooge, are not just like good comedy science fiction, but just great science fiction in general that do stuff that I am just so excited to see within Star Trek. Like Lower Decks, if you have not given it a try, if you really think that it is just a nostalgia fest, I really would poke you to give it a second chance, because I think, while I love pretty much all the Star Trek shows out there right now, Lower Decks in particular is something very, very special.
I'm sorry, I gotta be honest. I didn't join Starfleet to get in phaser fights. I signed up to explore, to be out in space making new discoveries and peaceful diplomatic solutions. That's boldly going. And you know what? I'd love to be in a string quartet. I love that when Riker was on the Enterprise, he was out there jamming on the trombone and catching love disease and acting in plays and meeting his identical transporter clone Thomas. That stuff may not seem as cool as what you guys do, but it's Starfleet all the way.
Number 5, For All Mankind. Of all the TV shows on this list, if there is one that I really want to evangelize most with this video, it is For All Mankind, because I feel like this is a show that is absolutely freaking phenomenal, and yet is by no means getting anywhere near the attention that it absolutely freaking deserves. The basic concept of For All Mankind, which was created by Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek Deep Space Nine writer Ronald D. Moore himself, is that it's an alternate history show where in the 1960s, Russia actually got to the moon first before the United States. And as a result of that one slight tweak in history, caused the space race to continue going on well past the 60s. And immediately, a lot of you may be thinking like, okay, that's kind of cool, but why is that so particularly interesting or fascinating? But what this show, I think, understood and recognizes about the space race, especially at the time, was how inspirational it was. Yes, it was at the time a very much like US versus Russia, like trying to see who's better. But for a lot of people, following that space race, it was so inspiring. It's why we got things like Star Trek, because people saw space and our desire to learn and grow and be more and see what's out there as aspirational and something to like look forward to with the project of humanity. And so as the space race continues in this alternate story, we start to see a coming together of humanity in a way that feels very wonderful and beautiful, despite the political and even social differences and roadblocks that are put up in front of us. This show is really about humanity overcoming its flaws and its oppositions in pursuit of those higher-minded ideals and using, you know, a love of NASA and the intricacies of like that history to be able to tell that story. And in many ways, this feels like a prequel to the Star Trek universe that I think Star Trek Enterprise, as much as I love that show, should have been. Flawed people ultimately working to do better and create a future for humanity that is better than ourselves. And yes, it gets dark. There are some dark storylines within this show, particularly around the politics of US versus Russia. But it is a show that is ultimately very inspiring and optimistic and is really, like I said, it feels like this is the path in the show to get us to that Star Trek future. And I think if you are a Star Trek fan, this is 100% a show for you. Also, by the way, it is backed up by some freaking phenomenal performances like every actor in the show, including some who I would not have thought were as good as an actor as I would have thought. Like Joel Kinnaman, I would never have pegged as like as phenomenal as an actor as he showcases in the show. So just fantastic work all around.
So before we go back to work, it's time to be pissed. All training evolutions for today have been canceled. I suggest you all take the weekend to go out, get drunk, kick your dog, gnash your teeth, howl at the moon, or do whatever suits your purpose. Come Monday morning, we're back to work.
Number 4, Sense8. But speaking of shows that I think are very Star Trekian in their methods, Sense8 is a show that I think gets at what I love about Star Trek as a franchise in a very different way. I cannot tell you how passionate I am about this show, because this show at its core is a series about empathy. It's about how human beings, despite our vast cultural differences, but our vast different experiences, our vast different like personalities and types, can find and empathize with each other on every single level. And it's about understanding and reveling in just the human experience. And it's also very queer as well. Like if you were looking for queer science fiction, this show has polyamorous people, it has gay men, it has queer polycules, it has trans women, and then it also has some stuff for you straights out there. But it is just a show that just revels in the totality of humanity, human emotion, human body experiences like sex. The basic concept of the show, which was created by the Wachowskis of The Matrix fame, as well as J. Michael Straczynski of Babylon 5 fame, is that a group of 8 people start to see each other and appear in each other's lives, even though they are all in different parts of the globe. And they start to realize that they can inhabit each other's bodies, they can talk to each other, they can feel each other's emotions and experiences, and they start to realize that they are all a new form of human being. And then of course there's some espionage-y, like action-y stuff that it's in all the Wachowski stuff of like a nefarious group that's out to get them and all the secrets that go into all of that. But the true joy of this show is just how well it's shot, how well it like uses visual language of cinema to connect human experiences in unique ways that I've never seen a TV show or visual medium done before. And really, again, just reveling in the experience of humanity. Like, I adore Sense8 so much. And if you have not watched it, go watch it. It is only 2 seasons and a movie. And while the movie is a little bit rushed considering that it was made after the show was canceled, I still think that this show is satisfying front to back and has a really complete and honestly heartwarming ending. And I could not recommend this show more than enough.
That locker room might have made my father the man that he is, but it also made me the woman that I am. After that, I quit the swim club. I quit trying to fit in, trying to be one of them. I knew I never would be. But more importantly, I didn't want to be. Their violence was petty and ignorant, but ultimately it was true to who they were. The real violence. The violence that I realized was unforgivable was the violence that we do to ourselves when we're too afraid to be who we really are.
Number 3, Severance. This is the newest show on this list and one that I fell in love with, even though it's only had its first season released so far, though a season 2 is on the way. The basic concept of Severance is honestly kind of difficult to explain. We follow a group of people who, when they go to work for this mysterious dark company called Lumen, they have their memories of their life outside of work and their life inside of work segmented. So when they are at work, they have no memory of their life outside, and so they only are aware of what the company tells them. So like the versions of them that work at the company only have memories of their life at the company and nothing outside of it. So they are basically new people day one of the company. And then when they go home, their minds are wiped of everything they learned at the company and they get to live their lives outside of that. And what this allows this show to do is probably one of the absolute most political and damning discussions of work culture. This show is very much down for the workers' revolution, and through its like weird metaphor, kind of explores office culture and this need to constantly work and grind yourself and only define yourself by your life at a company, and how companies use tactics like trying to build brand loyalty and company loyalty, and how ridiculous it is to try and build an identity and a sense of personhood and try to limit yourself within that. It really is just a great critique of work culture and capitalism, and also is a great thriller on top of that. Like some of the weird, strange things that are happening at this company and the ways that these characters start to uncover what's going on both inside and outside of the company are truly fantastic. And I have to tell you, every episode that I sat down to watch, I was like glued to the screen for every single second of it. Like Severance, one of, I think, the most important works of science fiction being made on TV right now, and I cannot recommend it enough.
So I'll never leave here.
You'll leave at 5. Well, actually, they stagger our exit, so 5:15. But it won't feel like it, not to this version of you anyway.
Do I have a family?
You'll never know.
And I have no choice.
Well, every time you find yourself here, it's because you chose to come back.
Number 2, Devs. This is a show that is honestly very similar to Severance, but instead of it being an ongoing series, Devs is a limited 8-run episode show created by Alex Garland, who many of you may know from his movie Ex Machina or Annihilation. And in many ways, Devs kind of is a sequel sister series to his movie Ex Machina, in that it is exploring these complicated ideas of free will, creation of life, as well as how all of that is sort of being corporatized through tech culture in Silicon Valley. And all of it also dovetails with very interesting ideas around things like Schrodinger's box and string and quantum theory. Like, this is one of the smartest shows that I think we'll ever watch. And it manages to interweave those all into a coherent narrative that manages to also be very, like, targeted at tech culture and these sort of billionaire tech CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg. The whole idea of the show basically follows a single programmer who gets wrapped up into a mystery surrounding the CEO of her company, which is sort of a Microsoft-esque type of deal, who is creating this program to try to predict the future, to try to use things like quantum theory and string theory in quantum mechanics in order to try to figure out how to understand the future. Honestly, I'm sort of sitting here and realizing that it's very difficult for me to describe the show without like having written about it, because it is just a very heady show. And I just honestly think that if you're really into anything that I just said, stop right now and go and watch Devs. It is fantastic. And if you need a little bit more coaxing to the show, I actually did a full video sort of analyzing the show with a little bit of mild spoilers, but you can sort of skip by that at the beginning. I sort of give warnings throughout the video over on my main channel. So I cannot recommend Devs enough. It is fantastic. You should go watch it. It's 8 episodes of your time that is well worth it.
The life we lead, with all its apparent chaos, is actually a life on tram lines. Prescribed, undeviating, deterministic. I know it doesn't feel that way, Sergei. We fall into an illusion of free will because the tram lines are invisible. And we feel so certain about our subjective state. Our feelings, our opinions, judgments, decisions. You joined my company. Gained our trust, gained my trust. Then stole my code on your James Bond wristwatch.
I don't know what you mean.
That would appear to be the result of some decisions, wouldn't it? About where you placed your allegiance, about who you would betray. But if we live in a deterministic universe, then those decisions can only have been the result of something prior. Where you were born, how you were brought up, the physical construction of your particular brain. It's the nature-nurture matrix, exactly like the nematode worm in your simulation. It's more complex, more nuanced, but still. At the end of the day, cause and effect.
But that being said, before we get to my number one pick, I want to just mention a few honorable mentions that didn't make the list, but I certainly considered putting on here. Westworld, honestly, Westworld would have made the list if it had stopped at season 1, but then it had to go into seasons 2 and 3 and upcoming season 4, and honestly, it never managed to recapture the magic of season 1, but that first season was freaking great. Russian Doll, a really clever and inventive time loop story that really analyzes ideas around trauma. The Man in the High Castle, another great alternate history science fiction show where the Japanese and the Nazis won World War II and ultimately speaks to how humanity still perseveres even in the darkest of times and still manages to find inspiration no matter what. 12 Monkeys, an absolutely bonkers wild time travel tale that is inspired by the movie of the same name that is just, it's not less necessarily great science fiction, but it's just schlocky, pulpy fun that I really enjoy. And finally, Dark. Dark did not make the list only because I have not seen it yet, but every single thing that I have heard about this show and the way that it is talked about makes me understand that this show probably should be on this list, so I at least wanted it to be mentioned. But that does bring us to the top of the list with number 1, The Expanse. I figured all of you probably knew that this was going to be my number 1 show. It is one of the most interesting and cohesively built science fiction series and stories and worlds that I have honestly come across, but also managed to tell all of that in a very human story as well. Like, the characters in the show are some of the most fleshed out, fully rounded, thoughtful characters that you will find in any science fiction show. My Girl Drummer, one of the best characters in science fiction, followed only probably by Amos, who is also one of the best science characters in science fiction. And then it also manages to do all of that while having one of the coolest eldritch horror science fiction stories of all time. I think one of the best sort of comparisons that I can make The Expanse to is, I think, Game of Thrones, but in science fiction. And when I say Game of Thrones, I mean like early seasons of Game of Thrones, where you have these sort of big existential threats of like the White Walkers going on in the background. You have something very similar here with The Expanse, but that's not the focus. The focus is on the very human political intrigues that are going on that sort of fall out from all the bigger stuff going on. And ultimately the political stuff becomes way more interesting. Basic idea surrounding The Expanse is that in the future you have Earth and Mars, who are sort of two very different societies. Like, Mars is very militaristic, proto-nationalist fascistic to a degree, and then you have Earth, which is very socialist and very elitist, has like all the resources and money and time to do whatever. And as these two sort of cultures battle each other, you have the Belters in the middle who are just fighting for their own independence and rights and sort of form very anarchistic groups and terrorist groups to fight back against who they see as the oppressing planet-based people. It's a truly masterful, like, political storyline that I cannot recommend enough, but again, filled with wonderful characters that I absolutely adore. And if you have not watched The Expanse, you 100% should. You should also read the books that it's based on because they're also fantastic, but easily the best science fiction show of the past 10 years.
This is your moment. You may think that you're scared, but you're not. That isn't fear. That's your sharpness. That's your power. We are belters. Nothing in the void is foreign to us. The place we go is the place we belong. This is no different. No one has more right to this, none more prepared. In your ladder, go through the ring, call it their own. But a belter opened it. We are the belt. We are strong, we are sharp, and we don't feel fear. This moment belongs to us. For Beltalowda!
Beltalowda! Beltalowda! Beltalowda!
So, that is my pick for the top 10 best science fiction shows of the last 10 years. But did you agree with me? Did I forget some? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. I'd love to hear if I inspired you to watch any of these shows, because you most certainly should. But beyond all of that, just thank you so much for watching. I hope that you, as always, my friends, live long and prosper.